So a typical ruler measures distances between places, and our major scale is the measure of distances between pitches. In reviewing where we put our fingers for different key signatures, I first wanted to remind us about the major scale pattern and how we measure distances between pitches. So a typical ruler measures distances between places, and our major scale is the measure of distances between pitches. And the major scale is the most commonly used scale, so it's what we use to measure out these distances. And we also don't use numbers for our measurement, we use letters. And this is the major scale pattern. It's that whole step, half step, whole step, half step that we've talked about before. And this is the most commonly used pattern in music. Our ruler starts on a C, and the reasons for that are kind of complicated. But a lot of this comes down to memorizing the fact that it starts on C, what the major scale pattern is, and that we have half steps between two places, E and F and B and C. Now in our ruler here, we can move things further up on the ruler, make them higher in pitch by making that particular note a sharp, or we can also move them down a half step by making them a flat. This does mean something complicated with our two places where we have half steps, the E and the F and the B and the C. If I wanted to, what I could do is I could say that this this F right here, I could make it an F flat, which would move it a half step down on our ruler, which really would put it here at an E. And so an F flat and an E would be basically the same thing. And same thing here, if I had my B and I wanted to move it up a half step, then this would be a B sharp, which is basically the same thing as a C. Now besides that, we really have these other half-step relationships that are between these other letter names. So if I move my C up a half step, it would be a C sharp. Or I could move my D down to a D flat. And this is kind of like as if you were to say, I want that to be just a ½ inch short of 2 inches. That might be the same as like a D flat, which is 1/2 step lower than a D. Or if I wanted it to be 1.5 inches, that might kind of be like a D sharp that's a half step higher than a D. So once again, here's the major scale pattern that we call the C major scale. E and F, B and C end up being close to each other because of our whole half pattern. And I want to show you how this works when we change to different major scales. So first of all, here is our major scale ruler. Now sometimes what we can do in music to make it either easier to sing or to play is we can change what our main emphasized note is. We can change the key. And so if I didn't want C to be my main emphasized notes, I could create the same major scale pattern, whole half, but I could start that on a different note. In this instance, let me show you how we would do G. So if we would do G as our main emphasized note, then what we can do is we can raise all of our Fs and we move that up to an F sharp. And then if we were to slide our major scale pattern, our major scale ruler over, you'd see that it actually lines up perfectly right there. So that if we have an F sharp, we now still have whole half, whole half, but starting this time on G instead of C.